Pleasure to have Jonas de Vos give our seminar this week. Jonas is a student at Ghent University in Belgium in the geography program there, PhD student. He also got his master's in geography at Ghent University and master's also in spatial and urbanism and spatial planning. So this is really the love of his academic life, at least. Have him here. Collaborated with in the past and ongoing opportunities to keep that connection strong. So Jonas will be talking about some of his master's research, but feel free to get acquainted with him in the meetings to come.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, Pat. So my name is Jonas Vos. I'm from Ghent University, and today I will talk about the influence of residential dissonance on travel behavior. And this was a part of my master thesis, which I did 2 years ago. And I did this together with Veronique van Akker and Frank Whitlocks of Ghent University. So I will start by telling something you probably already know, is that we have a big mobility problem. And this mobility problem is that we have an increasing car use. For instance, in Belgium, the total travel distance by car has increased with around 15% in comparison with 1995 and has almost doubled in comparison with 1980. Now, these numbers are about the same for other industrialized countries. And this increase in car use has also some negative consequences, such as congestion, air pollution, noise pollution, reduced public health because walking and cycling reduces, and so on. Now, in order to reduce this car use, we have to know which variables affect travel behavior and travel mode choice in particular. Now, in the 90s, there were a lot of studies about the effects of the built environment on travel behavior. And most of these studies focused on the differences between traditional neighborhoods and suburban neighborhoods. Now, the traditional neighborhoods are mainly built before the Second World War. The street network is mostly a grid structure, so a lot of X intersections. Building blocks are rather small, and also the roads are rather narrow. And the suburban neighborhoods, they were mostly built after World War with car accessibility in mind. They have a more random street network with T intersections and dead-end streets. So they were really built for accessibility by car and not really with walking and cycling in mind. And the building blocks are bigger and the streets are broader. This is also a picture. You might recognize this because this is in Sacramento. It's of a study of Susan, who's not here. But on the left, you can see that this is more a typical urban neighborhood. You have a lot of big sidewalks, places to park your bike. While on the right, you can see more suburban neighborhoods. Everything is oriented toward the car. There are no sidewalks, so it's difficult and unpleasant to go there on foot or with the bike. So most of these studies have as a result that in the suburban neighborhoods, the car is by far the dominant travel mode, and walking, cycling, and public transit is low. However, if you look at the more traditional neighborhoods, carless is still the most used travel mode. However, it's less dominant, and walking, cycling, and public transit use is higher than in the suburban neighborhoods. According to work of Robert Cervero and Kara Kuckelman in 1997, these changes between suburban and urban neighborhoods are due to 3 elements. They call them the 3 Ds. These are density, diversity, and design. So the first one is density. You see, for instance, on the left, it's a low-density neighborhood. On the right, it's a high-density neighborhood. So if density increases, the average travel distance reduces, and it stimulates walking and cycling. So for instance, if you live on the left neighborhood and you want to visit a neighbor who lives 10 houses away, you have to walk 200 meters, while on the right you only have to walk for 50 meters. The second D is diversity, and diversity relates to a mixed use of houses, offices, retail. So when these functions are mixed together, average distances reduces, and walking and cycling is stimulated, and car use is being discouraged. The last D is design. And for instance, on the left, you can see a pedestrian street, so no cars are allowed, which make it more pleasant to walk and more safe to walk. On the right, you can see a bus lane, which can decrease the travel duration of public transportation and make it a better alternative for car use. Here on the right, you can see a bicycle street. I think this picture is from Belgium or the Netherlands. And these are streets where cars are allowed, but they cannot pass the bikers. And on the left, you can also see that the design of the street network is important. On the left, you can see a more urban street network, and you can just walk straight from A to B. But however, in a more suburban neighborhood, you have to go all the way around to reach B. So people might decide to take the car instead of walking there. These studies that indicate that high density, high diversity neighborhoods positively affect travel behaviors. Travel behavior has also reached urban planners, and these urban planners have tried from the 1990s onwards to reduce car use by making compact, mixed-use neighborhoods. So there were a lot of concepts like compact cities, Mark Grote, New Urbanism, who had the compact mixed use in it. And so this reduces the distances and stimulates walking and cycling. And another advantage of such compact cities is that you can really live in an urban environment but still live close to open and green spaces. These concepts are also applicable for more bigger cities. On the right you can see a plan of Copenhagen. And in Copenhagen, they have tried to make a series of compact cities, see here, and they combined these little compact cities together with public transit that goes directly to the city center of Copenhagen. However, there is more recent research that indicates that not only the built environment affects travel behavior, but also attitudes and travel-related attitudes in particular can affect travel behavior. These travel-related attitudes can affect travel mode choice, which is rather obvious. So a person who likes to travel by bus will try to use the bus as much as he can. But however, these travel-related attitudes can also affect the residential location choice. So if that person who likes to travel by bus, that person will probably have a preference for living in an urban neighborhood because public transportation is best organized in these neighborhoods. So in the case that travel-related attitudes determine the residential location choice, so when that person will actually live in an urban neighborhood, then we can speak of residential self-selection. A lot of recent research has tried to answer the question of what affects travel behavior most. Is it the built environment or is it the attitudes? Most of these studies seem to agree on the fact that the built environment affects travel behavior mainly in an indirect way through attitudes. So this is really residential self-selection. So people have a preference for a certain way of traveling, and then they choose a neighborhood which is where you can travel as preferred. So the direct effect of the built environment on travel behavior is limited. Some studies say it's significant, others say it's not, but yeah, it's limited. And attitudes seem to have the strongest direct effect on travel behavior. So attitudes are the main predictors of travel behavior. However, the attitudes and the travel-related attitudes do not always determine the residential location choice. There might be certain constraints like low income, distance to work, varying preferences within households, which can result in a chosen neighborhood which is not the preferred one. So, for instance, if you have a couple and they're looking for a home, and the guy wants to live in an urban neighborhood, the woman wants to live in a suburban neighborhood, when they eventually choose a neighborhood, one of the two persons will not live in their preferred neighborhood, so you have a residential dissonance or mismatch. So there is a mismatch between the actual and preferred residential neighborhood. So when you have the actual and preferred neighborhoods, you can make 4 groups, and that's what Tim Schwanen and Pat did in 2005. They made 4 groups. The first one are the urban consonants. These are urban residents with urban land use preferences. Second is the urban dissonance. These are urban residents with rural land use preferences. Third one is suburban dissonance, suburban residents with urban land use preferences. And the last one, suburban consonants. These are suburban residents with rural land use preferences. People who are in the second and in third group are dealing with a residential mismatch, so these people do not live in their preferred neighborhood. This residential dissonance can also affect travel behavior because people who do not live in their preferred neighborhood might not be able to travel with their preferred travel mode because it's not ideally available. This figure is the main hypothesis that Tim Schwan and Pat started with. So they say that both the built environment and attitudes affect travel mode choice. For instance, the use of private vehicle will increase when you go from urban to suburban, and will also increase when you go from a more anti-car attitude to a more pro-car attitude. And the same we can see for public transit and bicycling, walking. The use of these transport modes will decrease when you go from urban neighborhood to suburban neighborhoods, and when you go from an anti-car attitude to a more pro-car attitude. So for this study, we try to answer the following questions. What is the degree of residential dissonance in Flanders? That's a region in Belgium and Europe. How does this residential dissonance affect travel behavior and travel mode choice? And can a reduction of this residential dissonance have a positive influence on travel behavior by reducing car use? For this research, we used a 2007 internet survey on mobility and lifestyles. So this had 3 parts. The first part was about lifestyles. It asked people what kind of literature they read, how they organized their holidays, what kind of leisure activities they performed. The second part was about opinions and habits about leisure activities and mobility. And it was especially this part that was very interesting for this research because it had a lot of information about attitudes towards different travel modes, attitudes toward travel in general. So this was the most important part for this research. And the third part was about socioeconomic factors. We distributed this survey in a first stage among students and faculty members of Ghent University and Antwerp University. So that's why you see a lot of red spots around Antwerp. And in the second stage, we also distributed the survey in local newspaper, so to get a well-balanced sample. At the end, we had more than 1,600 respondents after data cleaning. So I told you we tried to get a well-balanced sample. This worked a little bit, but if you look at the age, for instance, you can see that more than 50% of the respondents is in the group of between 20 and 29 years. That's, of course, because there are a lot of students. You can also see that education levels are quite high, and there are more women than men. Now, in order to measure residential dissonance, we have to have a factor that can unambiguously reflect the preference toward an urban or a rural residential neighborhood. Now, the problem was that we had a very large amount of information. We had 118 variables that said something about travel-related attitudes. So in order to reduce this large amount of information, we use the second-order factor analysis. So for people who don't know what this is, it's quite simple. You just perform a normal factor analysis, and then you factor analyze the obtained factors, so you get second-order factors. So this is the pattern matrix of the first factor analysis, or a part of it at least, because it was so big. So you see there are only scores for the first 5 factors. So you probably cannot read it, but the first factor is a pro-bicycling walking factor. And these are people who link positive aspects with the use of bicycling and walking. Second one is car accessibility. Find car accessibility and parking important for leisure activities. Third one is pro-car. These are people who link positive aspects with car use. And this goes on for 6 more factors. This is the pattern matrix of the second order factor analysis. On the left you can see the first order factors. And at the top you can see the obtained second order factors. So you have 2 factors, pro-car alternatives and a pro-car factor. In order to subdivide the respondents, we use the first factor, the pro-car alternatives factor. So respondents with a positive score on this factor have a preference for using public transportation, for bicycling and walking. And as a consequence, will also have a preference for living in urban neighborhoods due to the residential self-selection. People with a negative score on this factor will have a preference for using car, and as a consequence will also prefer to live in more suburban, rural environments. So we now have information about travel-related attitudes and the associated land use preferences, and when we combine this with their actual residential neighborhoods, so urban versus rural, based on their on the municipality they live in, we can make 4 groups. So these are almost the same as the 4 groups I talked about, with a little difference that now it's not suburban dissonance and consonance, but more rural dissonance and consonance, because it's more rural neighborhoods than suburban neighborhoods in this case. Then we also asked the respondents for travel mode choice, and the question was, which travel mode do you generally use to reach destination of the following leisure activities? So we have 6 different leisure activities. So if a person, for example, said he uses the car to shop, but he uses the bike to go out, then that person would be a car user and a bike user. So in the next figures, you will see percentages of travel mode use, and if you take the sum of these percentages, you will see it's more than 100, but this is the reason why it's more than 100%. So this table represents the first results of the study, and at the top you can see that almost 75% of the respondents lives in an urban neighborhood. But if you look at the land use preferences, you can see that 57% of the people has a preference for living in a more rural environment. And of course, this leads to a big group of urban dissonance. So a big group of people living in urban neighborhoods, but preferring to travel by car and preferring to live in a rural environment. So at the bottom, you can see that this leads to 51% of the people not living in their preferred residential neighborhood. This residential distance also affects travel behavior. So on the left, you can see the figure of the study in 2005. On the right, you can see our figure. So there are some differences noticeable. On the left figure, you can see that the built environment is more important than the attitudes, because all the suburban people travel more by car than all the urban people. However, if you look at the right figure, you can see, for instance, for car and bicycling and walking, that there is like almost no difference between urban distance and rural distance. So this suggests that attitudes and built environment are evenly important for these travel modes. However, if you look at public transit use, you can see that rural distance, although they live in a rural environment, travel more with public transit than urban distance. So this suggests that attitudes for public transit are more important than the built environment. On this figure, you can see that the car is the only travel mode where there is like a constant trend noticeable going from urban consonants to rural consonants. And this indicates that urban distance, although they would like to travel by car, are not able to travel by car as much as they can. So there are some constraints from the built environment, like congestion, parking problems, that limits car use in urban environments. But when we look at all the other car alternatives, so public transit, bicycling, and walking, we can see that rural distance travel more with these travel modes than urban distance. So although they do not live in the ideal neighborhood, they are able to travel quite a lot with these travel modes. So the conclusion of this figure is that rural distance are more able to travel with their preferred travel modes than urban distance are. This figure shows all the urban respondents. On the top, you can see the urban respondents with a very positive stance towards public transportation, walking, and cycling. On the bottom, you can see the urbanites with a very negative stance toward these travel modes. And if you now look at the use of public transit, you can see that it goes at the top, it's around 70%. So people with a positive stance towards car alternatives, they use it around 70%, but here it's only 10%. So attitudes are really important for public transit use. We can see same evolution for walking, bicycling. It goes from 90% to 50%. So attitudes are a bit less important here. And when we look at car use, you can see it increases from around 70% at the top to around 90% at the bottom. So this figure indicates that attitudes are important, but especially for walking, bicycling, and public transit. Not that much for car use. So I've told you there's a large share of residential distance in Flanders. So a lot of people living in urban neighborhoods, but having land use preference. So I will try to explain that by the fact that Flanders is really urbanized. There's a lot of urban sprawl, and then also told that the rural distance are more capable of realizing their preferred travel behavior than urban distance, and I will try to explain that by the fact that there is like a very cheap and spatially widespread public transit network available in Flanders. So there is a lot of urban sprawl in Flanders, and this started in the 19th century. So Belgium was the first country on European mainland where industrial revolution started. So this created a lot of employment in the cities. But since a lot of people did not have the time or the money to commute every day from the countryside to the city, a lot of people moved to the city to live there. However, the government was afraid of overpopulation, riots, diseases, so they responded to this migration by creating the most dense network of trains and streetcars of the world, actually. And they also gave cheap season tickets for using this train. So they really created like a commuting habit in Belgium. Besides that, they also gave cheap government loans for building houses on the countryside. And these were mainly detached houses with big gardens, so a really low density development. So this anti-urban policy created a first wave of urban sprawl in Belgium. After the Second World War, urban sprawl accelerated even further after the increased use of the car. And this car use was encouraged by a very dense road network in Belgium. So not only a dense rail network, but also a dense road network. And after the Second World War, they started to make highways, a lot of highways also. So at the bottom here, you can see these are numbers for, I think, 2010. So these are recent numbers. On the left, you can see the kilometers road per square kilometer. So you see Belgium is the first one. It has 5 kilometers road per square kilometer. So only Malta does better, but Malta is just a tiny island. So yeah, Belgium is really at the top here. And if you look at the kilometers highway per 100 square kilometers, you can see that Belgium, together with Luxembourg and the Netherlands, is also at the top. So very dense road network in Belgium. So a lot of countries try to restrict this urban sprawl by a lot of spatial planning regulations. For instance, in the Netherlands, they did that quite good. In Flanders and Belgium, they didn't really do a lot about it. So the first law about spatial planning is only in 1962, which is quite late because in the Netherlands it was, I think, 1903, which is a lot earlier. So what you see here are the first spatial zoning plans. We call them regional plans. And these were made at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. And they tried to restrict urban sprawl with it. But the problem was that there was a lot of lobbying from all municipalities. So every municipality wanted to have their own residential area, their own industrial area, their own recreational area. So the result was that you have like everything everywhere. There are recreational areas in every municipality, so everything was really spread out. So you can see here, for instance, this is an industrial area, but you have a small one here, small one here. Also with the green ones are the nature, also really dispersed. And what is interesting, so red is residential area, but here you can see like the red and white. These are residential areas along a road. So that's really building along a strip, and which is typically Belgian. So you can really go from this town to this town without seeing like the agricultural fields. And it looks a bit like this. It's very ugly, but yeah, it's there. And a negative aspect of that is that it really fragmentates the open and green areas. So yeah, the open fields are really fragmented. They become smaller and smaller. So this is a map of the built environment of Flanders. So you can really see that everything is spread out, and so the big cities are here, Antwerp and Ghent. But it's really difficult to draw a border around the cities because the border between city and countryside is really difficult to draw. Here, for instance, on the left side, you can see part of Flanders. On the right side, you can see part of the Netherlands. So there is a big difference. So the top one shows a built environment. So on the right, in the Netherlands, everything is way better clustered, while in Belgium, Flanders, everything is spread out. On the bottom, you can see the rail network. In Flanders, there are roads everywhere, while in the Netherlands, they managed to cluster roads way better than in Flanders. So, as a result of this urban sprawl, a lot of people live in like urban neighborhoods. But however, the open spaces have become scarce and fragmented, so there isn't really a lot of nature and open spaces anymore, and this has created like a preference for living in more rural environments. So when you combine these two together, you get a large share of urban people with rural land use preferences, so a large share of urban dissonance. So, yeah, I also thought that rural dissonance are more capable of traveling with their preferred travel modes, so by bus, walking, cycling, than urban dissonance are capable of traveling with their preferred car. So I try to explain this with the cheap and spatially widespread public transit system that exists in Belgium and Flanders. So this started with the dense rail network in the 19th century, but it's also present today. So there exists a mobility plan for Flanders, and this plan mainly focuses on the social aspects of mobility. They want to make every place accessible for every person. So with every person, I mean like persons who live in remote neighborhoods or persons with low income. So you get a cheap and widespread public transit system. So this plan mainly focuses on social aspects and not really so much on model shift. And one of the laws that came out of this mobility plan is called basic mobility, and it says that 90% of all Flemings have to have a public transit stop within 750 meters of their dwelling. However, since everything is so spread out in Flanders, you have to have a very widespread public transit system. However, the problem with that is that it's very difficult to organize public transportation in widespread regions. You have a lot of buses who are empty, and as a result, the public transportation company called De Lijn is only cost effective for 15%. So 85% of their income comes from taxpayers. But however, another result is that people who live on the countryside and want to use the bus, they are able to do so because there are buses everywhere. So the result is that rural dissonance are more capable of realizing their preferred travel behavior than urban dissonance. Urban dissonance seem to have difficulties using the car in urban neighborhoods. So it is possible to reduce residential dissonance and try to reduce car use. So first way of doing so is by changing the built environments of rural dissonance. And there are two ways of doing that. First of all, you can relocate or try to relocate rural dissonance to urban neighborhoods so that they will take more use of public transportation, walk more, cycle more. Another way of doing so is to increase the density and the diversity in rural or suburban neighborhoods. However, when you do that, you have to be aware that there are still people in those neighborhoods who like to travel by car. They chose to live in those neighborhoods because you travel easily by car. And when you increase the density and diversity, it's not really sure what these people will do. They can change their travel behavior and their attitudes according to the new built environment, but it's also possible that they just will hang on to car use or that they even will relocate to other rural neighborhoods. So this is very interesting questions. Might be interesting for future research. A second way of reducing residential dissonance is by changing attitudes of urban dissonance. So urban dissonance have a positive stance towards car use, but if you try to change these attitudes toward more positive attitudes towards car alternatives, they might use these modes more often. You could do that by trying to improve the image of alternative transportation modes by underlining the positive effects for public health, personal health, for the environment. And you could also try to improve the image of the city as a place to live in. However, it has been noted that improving attitudes will not always lead to changes in travel behavior. Some people might hang on to old travel behaviors. So when a person who likes to travel by car uses the car every day, and when his attitude changes, he just might hang on to this travel behavior because he's used to it. He does it every day. It has become a habit. So when we go back to the Flemish data, we can look what is the best to reduce residential distance. Is it relocating rural distance to urban neighborhoods, or is it best to change the attitudes or try to change attitudes of urban distance? So we can start with relocating. The part of the rural distance that will relocate or tend to relocate quite easy is the group that has a low satisfaction with their neighborhood and has a strong difference between the actual and preferred neighborhood. So this is in the part in orange. But if you look at the percentages, this group only accounts for about 4%, I think 4.3% of all the distance respondents. So this is only a small group. So if we then look at changing attitudes of urban distance, so the group of urban distance that will change their attitudes quite easily, the group in dark green, these are the people that have a high satisfaction with their neighborhood. So people with a low satisfaction, they will tend to relocate easier than they will change their attitudes. And it's also the group with weak difference between actual and preferred neighborhood. So because these people with a strong difference between actual and preferred neighborhoods, it will be difficult to change their very negative attitudes into positive attitudes towards bicycling and walking. When we look at the percentages, you can see that this group is about 20% of all the distant residents. So this group is a lot bigger than the orange group. So it seems that for Flanders, it is best to change or try to change the attitudes of urban distance into more positive attitudes. Now, to conclude, so I told there's a large amount of residential distance in Flanders. A lot of people living in urban neighborhoods due to urban sprawl. But however, a lot of people have preference for rural residential neighborhoods. So you have a large amount of residential distance because you have a large group of urban distance. The rural distance are more capable of realizing the preferred travel behavior than the urban distance because they are able to travel with public transportation quite easily in rural neighborhoods, and urbanites are not able to travel as much as they want to with their car in urban areas. Changing attitudes is the best way to reduce residential distance. But however, the effect on travel behavior will be limited. Yeah, I forgot to mention this before, but the effects on travel behavior will probably be limited because urban distance already were often forced to travel with car alternatives because car use was limited in urban neighborhoods. So that's why changing attitudes will probably have a limited effect on the travel behavior of people. So it will probably lead to a little bit less car use, but not very much. Thank you for your attention. If you have some questions, I'm willing to answer them. Yeah. That, yeah, we didn't really look at that because we only used the first factor
Yeah,
to subdivide them.
I know how you had to simplify
Yeah. Yeah, it might be interesting. There probably are people who are. Yeah, we didn't really check it, but it might be interesting to like make 4 groups of these and then look at their travel behavior. Yeah. Um, well, it is cheap. It started with the rail network in the 19th century. So they had cheap season tickets for laborers because they wanted to for people to commute from countryside to the city because they didn't want a lot of people living in the city. And it's still today. It's also cheap because they still look at yeah. How to say it? They don't want social exclusion, so they try to make it cheap so that everybody can still take part in their preferred leisure activity. For instance, it's public transit is free for people who are older than 65, and they were talking about eliminating that, but socialists said, no, you cannot do that because otherwise they will stay home, they will get depressed, and stuff like that. So they still have it. So they see transportation and public transportation as a way to be integrated in society. So that's why they try to keep it cheap. Yeah. Um, well, I think if you would just take 2 factors out of the large amount of variables, that they would not explain a very large amount of the how to say it, of the variance. So I think if you just took 2 factors, would only explain I don't know 15% or something. Well, now you have all the 9 factors, which explain I think like 40% of the variance, and then yeah, I think it just explains more variance if you do it like that than when you just subtract 2 factors from the whole range of variables. Yeah, I think if you just do first order factor analysis with two factors, then you have a lot of variables which are not really related to each other in the same factor. I think you also have to look at the eigenvalues and the scree plot. I don't. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, you have like 40% and 40%. Yeah. But it might be interesting to see if the two factors from the second order factor analysis would be about the same as if you do it with first order. Yeah, I think it's. Was quite a large amount.
Did that explain some of the urban distance? I'm not sure where they're moving. I know that they're at least.
I saw him, but he was not here. I didn't want to interrupt you. Okay, I just want to make sure you know. Yeah. Thanks, Bill.
That's not generally the case.
shorter than expected. Faster here than
Oh, really? Yeah, yeah.
along
Yeah, yeah.
right through Flanders.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody. Showed it for
Condition.